But the African armies were not trained in order to face the terrorist threat. So it's faced with that challenge that we must support them. And what does that mean practically? It means equip them, it means to provide them with support and allow them to clearly understand the nature of the weapons that are now opposite these armies and the men that use these weapons. So it's in terms of a war against terrorism that we must organize those forces, and we can't just take countries one by one with all the cooperation that we've already initiated. That's why I find the approach of the African Union a good one. It's an African intervention force that needs to be put in place, and Europe and France must provide, wherever possible, over and above the equipment, the means to make that force feared by terrorists.
Mr. President, you mentioned Libya earlier as perhaps the place of origin for the terrorists that attacked Arlit and Agadez. Now, have we identified the people behind the attack on the French embassy in Libya on the 23rd of April? And if it is Hakim, what are you planning? Are you planning another military action in southern Libya, as was asserted by media here in France this morning?
Well, there are several questions in what you've just raised. First question, have we been able to identify those who threatened our interests? Answer, no, not specifically. Are the terrorist groups that have set up their base in southern Libya? Answer, yes. Do we believe that they were directly responsible for events in Niger? That's in all likelihood the case. So together with the Libyan authorities, because after all it's the Libyan authorities that decide what happens on their soil on they alone, we must see what cooperation to set in hand in order to neutralize these terrorist groups. But you're right to mention the question of Libya here, because everything started in Libya. You'll recall some 2 years ago now, an intervention, perfectly legitimate, led to the removal of Gaddafi from power and his subsequent killing.
But didn't the coalition underestimate the consequences?
And then, of course, it all led to a form of chaos. And so we must do everything to ensure that the Libyans, who now have democratic institutions, can ensure the security of their territory. But then, of course, weapons were disseminated, and terrorists that at some time were at the service of Gaddafi spread in Western Africa.
Did Nicolas Sarkozy make a political error?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it was extremely difficult to provide for Libya's security, but it needed to be done by the international community. It wasn't for France or the UK to do it immediately afterwards. It was for the international community to be far more present, including perhaps, without a doubt, with forces.
So didn't we underestimate the risks of destabilization in the area?
I think that what was underestimated was the scale of the weapons that were circulating.
So arms and weapons deliveries.
Well, the weapons were already present. Gaddafi had a huge stock of
But
weapons.
France sent more.
Yes, the weapons deliveries, which raises the question, where do the weapons go that we delivered? So we must draw a number of conclusions from that. But what I mean to say here is that it started in Libya and it goes back to Libya, so we must support all efforts by the Libyan authorities so that we can fight terrorism now too.
So French military action is not ruled out in Libya?
No, listen, I mean, there are rules governing every French intervention. We're intervening with the legitimacy of UN resolutions and in no other setting. And thus far, we haven't been called upon by the Libyan authorities. So I really do want to make that clear.
Mr. President, back to Niger. Mokhtar Ben Mokhtar has claimed responsibility for the terrorist attacks on the Ariva site in Arlit and Agadez. He's a jihadist leader, and he was purported to be dead. What is your information? Is he alive or dead?
Well, you know, when it was announced, it was President Déby that made that announcement that there were Abu Zayyad and Ben Mokhtar who'd been killed in fighting in northern Mali. We asked that there be confirmation, notably through DNA analysis. We had that confirmation for Abu Zayyad, so I can indeed state that he is dead, that's for sure. But we never received that confirmation for Ben Mokhtar. Ben Mokhtar, whom we know that he was also one of those responsible for the hostage-taking in Algeria. Now, is he still linked to the Mujahou? All that's not firmly established, but I believe we must take that threat into account. We haven't seen an end to terrorism in Sahel.
Has he become your bin Laden?
I don't believe we should identify anyone personally, even for the purposes of the media. I can understand that it's easier, but terrorism, as we see clearly, is with groups that are also groups of traffickers. The Mujahou, well, they're really a bunch of drug traffickers, arms traffickers, and they can be used for terrorist purposes. So obviously there are multiple groups, and we must treat them as many threats.
Mr. President, terrorism also means hostage-taking. Now, do you have any news about our French hostages? Any proof that they're still alive? It's been said that some were transferred to southern Libya. Do you have any information on those?
All the information that we can receive would tend to confirm that they are alive. The hostages in Arlit, 4 hostages. As to the Ambori hostages, unfortunately, there was the claim, so to speak, of the groups holding Mr. Verdon, claiming a death, but no confirmation. So I take that claim of death for what it is. And then there's another hostage who it seems was adopted by Mujahou, and there's another hostage who still remains prisoner in Nigeria. We're putting out all contacts to secure their release. I can't say any more than that. I repeat this to the relatives when I see them. I give them what information I have, but I can't state this publicly, and I don't wish to do so as not to counter efforts underway. But since you're asking me, what I can say is that for several weeks now, we've been multiplying contacts. Why? Because now that we've completed the military operation in Mali, we see there an operation to establish contacts to secure the release of our hostages.
Now, in Mali, you have said that at the end of this year, there will be only 1,000 French soldiers remaining. In reality, the soldiers leaving Mali, are they coming back to France, or will they not be redeployed to other countries such as Niger or Burkina?
Well, some of these soldiers will return to France, to their barracks where they're based, and then the remaining part will remain in the region where we have a number of regiments that are based. You know that we have troops in the region and we plan to keep them there.
So no real withdrawal.
There's a withdrawal from Mali as such, because they're the MISMA forces that will become the peacekeeping forces will replace our own. There's absolutely no reason to remain in Mali. Even 1,000 soldiers is quite a presence. But we will be not far from places where there might be a terrorist risk in order to intervene as effectively as possible in conjunction with the peacekeeping force in Mali and with African armies in the countries considered.
So we're disengaging from Mali but reinforcing our presence in the region.
Yes, we're maintaining our presence. It's always been strong in the region. And of course, at the request of receiving states.
Mr. President, a word please on presidential elections in Mali slated for the 28th of July. Do you think that this timetable can be met? And should we not have immediate elections rather than waiting and doing it sort of haphazardly? Isn't it urgent to wait, keeping in mind that Kidal, in fact, the Malian army cannot even get into Kidal yet?
We need elections. That's a sound principle. Obviously, elections that are not open to question, that are unquestionable, and the date at the end of July allows the electoral process to go forward. Let me remind you that there was a coup that took place in Mali before elections were held. So everything was done so that elections could be held, and that was in 2011. Sorry, that was in 2012. So we have every possibility which will allow the Malians to organize elections in July 2013, as long as Mali has been fully liberated. But there remains the question, and you're right to point this out, of Kidal, because the Malian army is not present in Kidal. So we have said that the Malian administration must be able to organize elections. It will therefore be present, but discussions are currently being held between the authorities of Mali and the MNLA so that we can find the best conditions.
Is it on track?
And it's well on track, and I fully understand the demand of the Mali authorities, who consider that everywhere there must be the civilian administration and at some time the Mali army too.
So no special treatment for the Tuareg rebels, as you were accused?
Absolutely not, but at the same time, respect too, not for this movement as it happens, but for the Tuareg reality, for the reality of the population of this part of Mali. And let's avoid all clashes. So our responsibility is to do our utmost so dialogue can happen, so that organizations can also be involved in the elections and elections can be held. And we're on the right track to get there. And France will, of course, support the civilian administration. And if it's possible and necessary, the Malian army.
Now, during your election campaign, you said that you would defend human rights and democracy. In Chad, deputies and journalists have been imprisoned for a month, and many are upset about your silence. Now, since the Chad army helped out the French army, do you not feel that you're indebted to President Deby?
No, that's not at all the nature of my relationship with Africa, with Chad. Chad has paid a heavy toll in securing the liberation of Mali from the terrorist hold. And I won't forget that, because I know what the Chad army was capable of achieving. But at the same time, I have principles. And when an opponent or when a minister is blamed in terms of his own freedom, I stated there's no indulgence in terms of what our solidarity was in a fight that needed to be waged. So human rights are not a pick and choose. They remain the position of France. And I said that to President Deby.
Well, there should be a trial. You fought for that to take place and for it to be resumed when you're in Kinshasa 6 months ago, freeing the Franco-Cameroon national Thierry Michel Atangana and with President Bila, but nothing is moving forward.
Well, we can't blame France for that. What we could be blamed for would be to say nothing or to do nothing. So, since I have the opportunity of speaking to you about this matter, in Cameroon, I told President Biya that, of course, in full respect of the Cameroon judiciary, everything must be done to find a solution. It's been too long now, 15, 20 years that this has lasted, and it's unacceptable. And in the DRC, I went there myself. I gave my support so that the trial could be held. I said how vital it was to have this trial. I continued to exercise pressure on President Kabila for the trial to be held and the truth be shown.
Mr. President, the Algerian President Abdelaziz Bouteflika was hospitalized in France for health care, and he is said to be recovering at the Invalides in Paris. Do you have any information about him? Is he improving? I would assume so if he's recovering, but will he be going home soon?
Well, it's not for me to report on the state of health of the Algerian president or even to state when he will return to his own country. That's a matter for him to decide. What I can, however, tell you is that he was indeed admitted to hospital and he's now convalescing, and he's resting at the Invalide Hospital where he's receiving all necessary treatment and care. And then, of course, he will return, I hope, as speedily as possible to his country.
Well, now on Algeria, they're one of the few regimes that's resisted the Arab Spring movements. Now, should we ready ourselves for the post-Bouteflika era, or can we be expecting chaos as the president leaves?
I went to Algeria a few weeks ago now, and I have very good relations with President Bouteflika and the Algerian authorities, because France and Algeria, our links go back a long way. Of course, there are still wounds that are healing, but we have a future to prepare together. And I know what the Algerian community in France represents, the French of Algerian origin, not forgetting the French people who were living in Algeria and who left in the conditions that we know. I know the pain of the Harki. That's the reality of relations between France and Algeria. But I want these relations to be essentially forward-looking, because Algeria, like Africa, but Algeria has major resources and a growth capacity to which France should contribute. Now, is there a risk of chaos? I don't believe so, because there is a strength in the Algerian institutions, but it's a matter of Algerians to determine their future. Elections are planned in 2014, and I have confidence in that process.
Now, in Tunisia, the ruling Ennahda party is stepping up its rhetoric against the Salafists. Is your upcoming visit a sign to support Ennahda, or will you continue to support the secular parties?
Well, I support Tunisia and its democratic transition, because that's where the Arab Spring began, and that's where it must succeed. So there's now this constitution that is at last ready and will be tabled, and then there will be a process that will follow its course. And let me say to all democratic parties, those that are part of this process, that they enjoy the full support of France.
Including Ennahda?
Well, Ennahda is the result of an electoral process, and it was therefore chosen by part of the Tunisian people. There'll be fresh elections. So in Tunisia, I'll discuss with all the secular and non-secular, and it's not for me to say who I prefer. Even if we know the long-standing ties I have with a number of figures, I have excellent relations with President Marzouki. In the name of France, I can support a process, even wish to see it succeed in the most striking manner. I don't wish to interfere in the Tunisian political life.
Well, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, all of these represent the spread of Islamists. Now, should our diplomacy distinguish between the good and the bad Islamists?
Our diplomacy must insist on democracy and the transitions that lead to it. In Libya, as I said, we must support the authorities that also the result of elections. There are serious risks of destabilization. We're familiar with those. In Tunisia, the process is underway. It must now be completed. In Algeria, you mentioned the fact that it wasn't a country concerned by the Arab awakening, but in fact had undergone its change in very tragic circumstances after a full-blown war that was waged on terrorism. And in Morocco, where I also went, there's a democratic process that is underway. So our diplomacy is to have relations with countries that are close through our historical, geographic ties and through our common interests. We have relations to maintain and to have democracy as the objective.
Now back to Syria. Bashar Assad has declared on TV that he would be a candidate for president in 2014. Now, do you still think that he needs to go?
100,000 killed in Syria over the past 2 years. the Assad regime is the prime responsible party for that, crushing part of his opposition, using weapons that are supplied sometimes from outside, or using armed groups that also come from outside.
Chemical weapons?
And with the question mark as to the possible use of chemical weapons. And do you think that faced with that situation, France should close its eyes? It's never closed its eyes and is marshalling as far as possible the international community to find a political solution. That's the prospect held out by the Geneva meeting. And I hope that conference will take place. It will be to ensure a transition without Assad. Otherwise, I mean, how could the opposition accept such a process?
So as a prerequisite for the Geneva Conference, does Assad have to go?
I've said this for a long time, and if this conference is to be held, it's to prepare the post-Assad era and not the presidential elections where Assad is announcing that he's standing.
But the red line that's been mentioned by Barack Obama seems to be elastic. There's increasing proof recently about the chemical weapons. I mean, that is the crucial issue. The red line seems to keep moving.
It's one of the questions that can justify an intervention at some point in time. All proof must be provided, and I've asked in the name of France that inspection is made on the use of these chemical weapons.
So far, the inspections have brought up nothing.
The authorities are refusing to allow it.
There are chemical weapons, and there are also the ground-to-air missiles that are being delivered by the Russians. Is this arrival? Doesn't this arrival of these new weapons make Western intervention impossible?
We cannot accept that at a time when there's the Geneva Conference about to be held with the idea that a political solution might be found, that weapons at the same time be delivered by Russia to the Assad regime, and that there cannot be either weapons delivered to the opposition. So what have I done now for several months with the British and David Cameron? I have made sure that Europe should be able to lift under certain conditions and partially the embargo on weapons to the opposition. What are the conditions? That these weapons, we have the experience of Libya, should not be given and provided to groups that tomorrow that might turn against us or threaten the balance in the region. That's the first condition. Second condition, that the opposition should be united and able to provide these guarantees. And the third condition is that these weapons, if they are to be delivered, they must be delivered because there's no political solution found. So France's approach is we'll do our utmost to ensure that Geneva succeeds.
With the Iranians as well?
Well, then there's the question mentioned by some to complicate things.
Would that be Moscow?
Well, it's always those who don't want to find a solution for the time being, but we say to them, make sure that the solution is political if you don't want it to be military. Let's ensure that Geneva can happen. Let's not complicate the list of participants in Geneva. Let's exert maximum pressure, including militarily. That's the possible raising of the embargo. Since Russia is supplying weapons, we can consider that option. We don't want it, but let's do our utmost to the political solution to prevail.
So will there be a strong initiative by France in Geneva?
Well, that initiative has already been taken, and now for a long time we've been in the vanguard.
Are you readying a military intervention on the ground?
Today, we believe the solution must be a political solution. But in order for the political solution to prevail, we must keep the military pressure option on the table.
Lebanon's Hezbollah admits to fighting alongside Bashar Assad's regime. Do you not fear increasing tension between the Shiites and Sunnis?
Well, of course, there's a very serious threat. First of all, of even more dead in Syria. 100,000 dead already, military crushing of the opposition, given weapons shipments by Russia to Syria and the presence of Hezbollah. And if we're in that situation, there will necessarily be consequences in Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and with Israel that will not remain idle. And now with the question of the Golan that arises again, we think it's Syria. No, it's the whole region that's affected. That's why I want the Geneva Conference to succeed.
But don't we really have to wait?
No, it's going to happen in a few weeks' time, this conference, and then if that conference would not to succeed, or if it could not be held, there would, of course, be initiatives to be taken. I mentioned one with the lifting of the embargo under the conditions I set out. But on that, of course, France was every time the first to act. As soon as I was elected president, the question arose, what could we do? We were the first to supply humanitarian aid. We were the first to recognize the opposition as the sole legitimate representative of the Syrian people. With the British, we were the first to mention an arms embargo being lifted, the first to denounce the use of chemical weapons, that it might be a red line.
Though we do get the impression that it's a power struggle between Washington and Moscow.
It's absolutely normal that such a dialogue should take place, because we know part of the solution lies in Moscow, so it's good for the US to engage in this relationship. But France will do its duty and will do this knowing that it's first and foremost through the political solution that we will find an outcome to this tragedy, which is what it is, and we clearly see that it's the security of the region that's under threat.
Mr. President, thank you for granting this interview to France 24, RFI and TV5 Monde. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.